Hello, I am Thomas Prostko, and I experimented with forming and building techniques. I started my exploration with paper and cardboard. I started by experimenting with how to shape the material, cutting, rolling, and tearing it to see how I could make different shapes. Next, I made a bunch of little modules and assembled them together to make this fun little sculpture. I found that they had a whole lot of little nooks and crannies that could be like wedged together and stuck together in order to hold a shape like this. I did some more experiments of trying to push different materials to its limit. For example, I tried to make the tallest tower that I could out of a piece of paper by cutting notches into it and stacking it on top of each other. The tallest I could get was about a page and a half tall, which is still pretty tall, though not quite as tall as I would have expected. I also tried experimenting with how bendable the paper was, and by only using one type of paper, I realized that it would bend even the parts I didn't want to bend. So if I really want the paper to bend around other sheets of paper, I need to use different thicknesses of paper. Next, I took one of my old forms that I had made earlier and added paint to it, which I found that by adding paint to it, it starts to give it a bit more of a specific meaning. When it's all white, it seems to be very up for interpretation, but once you add that color to it, it starts to assign meaning to it that it did not have before. My next materials were wire, mesh screen, and foil. I started with the screen by folding it, bending it, twisting it, doing all types of things to experiment with how it made shapes. I found that the most important thing about this was that it really liked to prick my hands. The ends were very sharp, so I found that if I was going to do this in a classroom, I would like my students to wear gloves. I found that gloves were super helpful when working with this material. Here I made a form out of a water bottle where I made this like really interesting table looking shape where it almost looked like a draping tablecloth on top of nothing. I experimented with putting it in different ways, which I found changed its meaning a lot. It looked more like a flower pot, then on its side it looked a bit more like a comet. So changing the orientation really affected how you could interpret this medium. Finally, I combined all of my wire mesh forms together to make one really big shape, which turned out to be kind of like another flame-like shape. I found that the wire mesh played with the light in really interesting ways I really liked. As it like layered on top of each other, it would get like darker and darker, but also lighter and lighter the less mesh there was on top of each other. I'm really curious to see what would happen if I added a little bit more color to this to be able to make it like interact with the light more in some more interesting ways. I moved on to trying three different types of wire. The first being aluminum armature wire, which was definitely the most flexible out of the wires. However, it was not the most meticulous of them. It was very difficult to bend minute details without special tools. I started by making this hand, which I was able to make super duper flexible, super duper bendable, and I even put it into a glove to make it a full hand and make it kind of like Thing from the Addams Family. I moved on to copper wire next, which I found was a lot more rigid than the aluminum wire. However, it had much more springy properties to it and a little bit more weight to it as well. So I was able to make all of these springy forms that were able to move around in really interesting ways with this material. From there, I tried making boxier forms out of the wire. I was able to get fairly straight edges and smooth curves out of the wire. With a lot more time and persistence, I could probably get it really, really straight and have them be like these really nice, like smooth edges that are like really, really squared off. Finally, I used a wire coat hanger to make a hanging sculpture, which this managed to have the cleanest lines out of all three, but I think that's because it was stored already in like nice straight lines, so I didn't have to bend the lines to be straight, though it was very difficult to bend by hand without special tools. I need to use pliers to bend this still. So, for this gauge, I think I would like the armature wire a little better because it was easier to bend than this stuff. However, this does already start out with really nice clean lines to begin with. So if you want something to be very, very boxy and you don't want to do that much work to it, a coat hanger is for you. Next, I experimented with aluminum foil, and I started by creating a bunch of shapes out of it, once again curving, bending, and folding it. I also created a cast of my hand out of the foil, as I felt it would make a really interesting shape. So next I combined all the pieces together to make this sculpture of a shackled hand. I found that aluminum foil was the most malleable of all the substances, that it was able to be like manipulated and modified to be a big sculpture, and it also played with the light in an interesting way because of how reflective it was. Finally, I combined my copper wire and also my aluminum mesh to kind of create a form of a copper sculpture and playing off of the idea of like the floating table thing. I was also able to get the sculpture to move, which found made it really difficult to balance it because I couldn't get the thing to stay right where it would be able to move but also not fall over. That took a really long amount of time to do. But I eventually made a sculpture that I was pretty happy with of like this floating aluminum thing on the copper wire. Next, I started working with wood, and I was immediately drawn to tongue depressors and popsicle sticks because I found them were really easy to cut with scissors, and they were also really nice to glue together. So I started by not gluing anything together and just weaving popsicle sticks together to make a sculpture. However, I found that doing this, my sculptures liked to explode in my face, so I wasn't able to make anything really big, just this star-like sculpture by like stacking and weaving sticks together. I then also made this table-looking structure out of tacky glue and tongue depressors, which I found works really, really well together because the tacky glue is nice and sticky. It's able to hold it to keep its shape, unlike white glue. And also, the flat surfaces allow it to adhere to each other really, really well, really, really strong. Next, I combined tongue depressors and popsicle sticks together to create this little action figure sized balcony, which I found really, really nice. And I kind of wanted to keep it as like a diorama piece for my action figures. So I ended up staining it with raw sienna acrylic paint that I like watered down. And I also added some watered down black paint to give it two different tones. Next, I made two sculptures out of sticks that I found in my backyard. The first one I held together with lashings because I had learned how to do lashings a while ago in Boy Scouts and was never able to use them to make anything cool. So instead, I made this pyramid that I held all together with lashings. And it held together pretty well. I probably could have done them a little bit tighter and it would have held a little bit stronger. Next thing I did was make a hand out of sticks that I held together with tacky glue. And this thing was the bane of my existence because since the sticks were round, they did not adhere very well and I had to tape the hand together and wait for it to dry. And tacky glue kind of takes a while to dry, so it just took forever to make this sculpture. And then I placed it out in my yard, out where I found the sticks, and I found that it blended into its surroundings really well, which could have a really interesting meaning that beauty in nature isn't always visible, and that sometimes you have to look for it. One of the featured artists of this chapter is Todd Baldwin, who uses found objects and construction materials in order to make small sculptures. He showcases his artwork at Tiger Strike's Asteroid in Philadelphia, and he tends to think about value with his materials as well as the permanence and impermanence of his works. He uses much of the same materials that I've used so far, such as cardboard, wood, and foam, to make little sculptures in similar ways that I have. He aims to elevate humble materials and give them new meaning and expression and allows you to see them in a bit of a new light as not just a construction material, but as an art medium. My next material was found objects, and I started off by taking a copy of V for Vendetta and using that to make an art piece, along with a V for Vendetta Halloween mask that I had bought a while ago. And I made a V for Vendetta mask out of a copy of V for Vendetta. So I took everything, organized it, and then laid it onto it, kind of like a collage and also kind of like paper mache. I found this to be one of the better pieces that I made from this. I was really happy with how this one turned out and I found it very interesting to use the comic panels almost like splotches of color to be able to make an artwork out of a bunch of other images and yet still have them be readable. Next, I made this sculpture out of action figures, trying to stack them on top of each other and have them grab onto each other. I find that each of the action figures had different levels of posability. The ones that were least posable made really great foundations, while the ones that were super bendable made great ones to stack on top. Though, even still finding this out, I couldn't really make a stack of higher than three or four action figures, so I ended up making a really wide composition as opposed to a really tall composition. Next, I cut up some playing cards and added like a few notches in them and folded them to make this flame like structure. I found playing cards to be a really interesting medium to use both because they're flexible and rigid and they're able to hold their shape really well, but also because there is a great variety of playing cards nowadays, and so you could probably make a lot of different sculptures all with different types of playing cards. So the last thing I did with found objects was take this TV that I have, cover the entire side of it with Legos. I would have done the whole thing, but I ran out of Legos, so I wasn't able to do the whole TV. But I found that this was a really interesting process where it was almost like making like a tile mosaic on the side of this TV, except instead I was using Legos. I held all of them on with loops of duct tape because I figured it would be faster than gluing them, and it's also reversible. I could just rip all the Legos off if I want to. And I also added two minifigures to the side in order to give it a little bit more depth. Or actually, I think I added three minifigures to the side to give it a little bit more depth and also a little bit more emotion. Another featured artist of this chapter was Sandra Eula Lee, who uses found objects to make commentary on political and social issues. She tries to find a wider meaning in her materials, such as their personal value or impact on the world. She tries to use objects that we use every day that we leave behind in order to make metaphors related to how we use the object. I find that her work was most similar to my action figure sculpture, as I used well-known characters to convey the idea of screens competing for our attention, and a lot of her work deals with our objects using like how we use our objects and how they impact the world. So I found that the materials I was the most drawn to were the ones that were the easiest to manipulate, but also rigid enough to hold its shape, which I found the wire mesh as well as playing cards and cardboard both did this very well because they were all really easy to cut, really easy to shape, and also rigid enough to like hold their structure without needing to be glued together or strengthened in any kind of way. I thought the mesh screen offered the most interesting results as it played with the light in interesting ways, and its transparency was really, really interesting and compelling. I found natural wood the most difficult to work with because of its roundedness and it not being able to glue together very well. It just took a really long time, though lashing it together worked very well. I think I would like to go a bit further with paper, cardboard, and mesh screen. I want to experiment more with coloring mesh screen and trying to make bigger, more complicated things out of paper and cardboard.